In this lesson, we're going to go over how to graph rational numbers. So here's some tips for graphing on a number line. One of the things you have to remember is that the distance between the labeled intervals must be equal. So for example, if you're labeling this interval right here 0 and this one 1, then this one has to be 2, so that the distance between each tick mark on the number line is equal to 1. If I decided that this was 1 and this interval over here was 2, then halfway between 1 and 2 would have to be 1.5. So the other thing is that distance on an imaginary line are like measurements. So if this distance is 1/2, then this distance is 1/2. 1 plus 1/2 is 1.5. 1.5 plus 1/2 is 2. Another thing to remember is that if this marks 0 to the right is the positive direction, and to the left is the negative direction. So -1 would be here, +1 here. Now let's get to graphing. So first we're going to go ahead and we're going to make sure we're following the directions. The directions say to graph the number that are given on the number line. So here I have the number -7/4. So notice that my number line doesn't have anything on it other than some tick marks. So first I had to decide how I want to go ahead and arrange it. I can pretty much number this however I want, as long as I'm following those tips that we went over on the left side. This is a negative number. I know it needs to be to the left of 0. So here's where I'm going to mark 0. And it's kind of hard when you have an improper fraction to kind of look at what it's between. So if I go ahead and I convert 7/4 to a mixed number, 4 goes into 7 once with 3 left over. It gives me 1 3/4. And because these are negative, I know that this lies between -2 and -1. So again, if that is marking 0, and I went ahead and 1, 2, 3, 4, -1, 1, 2, 3, 4, -2, 1, 2, 3, 4, -3. Now I can go ahead and I can figure out exactly where -7/4 would go. And because I know that it's negative, it's going to go to the left, and it's beyond the 1. So it's -1. This would be 1/4, 2/4, and 3/4. So here on the number line, I actually write the number as it's given. I don't have to circle it. That was just a me thing to emphasize for you. So let's go ahead and look at what I did. First, I looked at the number that I was starting with, and I figured out about approximately where it would be. Then I set up my number line. So at first I went ahead and figured out where 0 was because the number was negative. Then I chose to make sure that because I was looking at a number that was divided into fourths, I chose intervals of every 4 to equal 1. Then, once I had gone ahead and determined the numbers that on my number line where -1 3/4 would be, I went ahead and I graphed it in the appropriate. On this next example, I have several numbers. And so let's go ahead and think about when we had talked about putting numbers in order, we have to recognize things that are neutral, numbers that are positive, and numbers that are negative. So what's my biggest number? Would be my most positive one, 1/8. What is my least number? It has to be one of the fractions. And I noticed both of those fractions are between 0 and 1 for their absolute value, which means they have to be between 0 and -1 on a number line because they are negative. So first, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put 0 in the middle. And that's because I know that 0 is going to divide the negatives and the positives. And then I need to go ahead and decide how I'm going to number this. So I see that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 intervals. So if I go ahead and I create this as my 1, and then I would have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 over here, this would be negative 1. So I know that I have to go 1/8 in the positive direction to get to 1/8. So if I divided it into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 intervals, 1/8 would be exactly here. So I put a point to mark the location and put in my 1/8. Now over here, I have 8ths, but my denominators are 5 and 3. So what I need to do is kind of figure out approximately where it would be. So I know that negative 1/3 has an absolute value of 1/3. And because the absolute value of negative 1/3 has an absolute value of 1/3, it's going to be about 1/3 of the way. Well, I'll do a little math. 1/3 of 8 pieces would be 8/3, which is 2 and 2/3, which means I have to go 1, 2 segments, and about 2/3, which is close to that one, and that's where negative 1/3 would be. So to do negative 1/5, I would do the same thing. So the absolute value of negative 1/5 is 1/5. So I need to be 1/5 the distance. And since my segment's divided up into eighths, I'm going to do 1/5 times 8, which is 8 over 5, which is 1 and 3/5. So 3/5 is a little bit over a half. So again, I would go 1 segment in the negative direction, and then just a little bit over the halfway mark. And there's where I would put negative 1/5. So why do you think we would want to have the numbers on a number line? Well, one of the things it does is it tells us the order of the numbers. And so I can say now, if I was to write these numbers in order from least to greatest, it would be the least would be negative 1/3, then negative 1/5, and then positive 1/8. Notice that even though 0, negative 1, and 1 are marked on my number line, they don't have points there, they're just locations to help me find these. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take these numbers and think about which one is the least and which one is the greatest, and how you would go ahead and order this. So did you notice that these two numbers happen to be our least and our greatest? So we don't usually want to go ahead and label with fractions. Sometimes we do. But we can want to go ahead and go beyond or more negative than the least number. We're not going to be labeling in increments that are equal fractions. So I would go ahead and I would have negative 4 over here. And then thinking about how many segments I have, which is 16, and I need to go all the way to 6, I know that from negative 4 to 0 would be 4, and then 4 plus 6 would be 10. So I need at least 10 intervals. So when I did this, I chose to use an interval that had each one as 1. So now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put my points on my number line. I'm going to start with some easy ones. So 21/5, converting that to an improper or mixed number. 5 goes into 21 4 times with 1 left over. So it's 4 1/5. So 4 1/5 is very close to 4, but to the right of it. So now, because I'm using this big marker, I'm going to mark a point. I'm going to show it in green. There's the little arrow, and show that is the location of 21/5. So now I'm going to do negative 1/2. Oh, it's pretty easy. It's halfway between negative 1 and negative 2. Negative 2 would be right there. So that means negative half, and again, it's getting a little crowded for me, would be right there. So now negative 3 1/3. Well, it's closer to negative 3 than it is to negative 4, and it's 1/3 of the way, which is approximately right there. So if I was to write these numbers in order from least to greatest, here's what I would get. Negative 3 1/3 is the least. So why is it important to help us know what the order of numbers are? Well, it's because we want to use them to understand how things rank. Just like in high school, we go ahead and we look at students' GPAs and we rank them to see who's the best in the class and who needs a little bit more work so they don't. So here's our problem. It says scientists are studying temperatures and weather patterns in the northern temperatures. They recorded the temperatures in degrees Celsius in the table below and as recorded from emails from various participants. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is represent each reported temperature as a rational number. So let's do that. So here it has descriptions of the numbers, and we're going to write them as a rational number. So if we're below 0, that means we are negative. If the temperature is 12, that means it's just a positive 12. Negative 4 is already given to us. 13 below would be negative 13. 0 is 0. 2 above puts us at positive 2. 6 below, negative 6. And of course, negative 5 is negative 5. So next, we're going to order the rational numbers from least to greatest. And then we want to put the numbers on a number line. So it doesn't matter as far as those two, which one we do first. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to order them from least to greatest last, because if I put them on the number line, it'll be done for me. Okay, so 0 is at 0. And now I'm going to do the rest. So this should be pretty easy for you too. So these are fancy scrolly brackets. Negative 13 is to the leftmost, so that's going to go first. Negative 12, negative 8, negative 6, negative 5, negative 4, 0, and 2. So for every point on my number line, I have to have a resulting number in my set. So here's something that we're going to have to deal with all of our lives: money. So Jamie's bank account statement shows the transactions below. So we're going to represent each as a rational number, order them from least to greatest, and graph the transactions. So let's start. Okay, so first you might need to know what debits and credits are. Debit means you got money in your account. Credit means they took money out. A charge is something you pay, so it comes out of your bank account, meaning it's a negative number. Withdrawing is also negative because it means you're taking money out. Deposit means you put money in. Debit is another word that we already talked about. It means money in. And we already said charge is something that is coming out, so it's a negative. So when we go ahead and we write these as rational numbers, we don't have to put the dollar sign, and we don't have to put the zeros at the end for money. Okay, so there we go. So now what's the least number? Negative 20. What's the greatest number? 12 and 2/10. So we definitely know we have to go ahead and be here at negative 20. I could add more tick marks, but I don't have to. I can skip around a little bit. So we know that we have 16 parts. So if we go ahead and we go by twos, we should be okay. Okay, now let's start. So negative 20 is my least. So I got that one. And then I can go in whatever order I want. It really doesn't matter. 12 and 2/10. Well, here's 12. And we know that it's close to 12. So there would be 12 and 2/10. Negative 4 and 800ths is negative 4, but just a little bit more negative. So there would be negative 4 and 800ths. Negative 1.5. Okay, so let's see. If this is 0, then this is going to be negative 1 is halfway in between. So negative 1.5 is going to be half between the negative 1 and the negative 2. So right there would be negative 1.5. We already have negative 20. So now let's do 5.5. So 5.5, well, here's where the 5 is. So 5.5 is going to be halfway between 5 and 6. So right there would be 5.5. 3 and 9500ths is very, very close to 4, but it's just a little bit less than 4. So we're going to show it to the left. Now, it's pretty hard doing this with paper and pencil to really show accurately the location. So it's okay if it's just pretty close. And then our last one is positive 3. And positive 3 is exactly halfway between 2 and 4. So there would be my 3. So now let's go ahead and put them in order. Negative 20, then negative 4 and 800ths, then negative 1.5, then 3, then 3 and 9500ths, then $5.50, and $12.20. Oh, summer. Wish it was here. It's not, though. Right now, it's almost winter. Okay, so during the summer, Matt and Mom monitors the water levels in their parents' swimming pool to make sure it is not too far above or below normal. The table below shows the numbers they recorded in July and August to represent how the water levels compare to normal. So normal is what our 0 is, because it's the neutral number. It's not above, it's not below. So normal is going to be represented by the number 0. We want to do what we've been doing. So try this one and see how you do. Let's go. So every time I see above, that means it's a positive value. And every time I see the word below, I know it's a negative. So what is my least and my greatest? So the most negative I see is negative 1 1/4. And the biggest number, remember, if the numerator is 1, then the one with the smallest denominator happens to be the biggest one. So this one is the biggest positive number I see, which is 1/2. Now there's no tick marks on here, so I can do whatever I want, but I know that I'm comparing things to 0 as above and below. I know my least number is negative 1 1/4, so if I approximate the distance, 0, negative 1, negative 2, then this would be my 1 and positive 2, and I'm ready to go. So let's go ahead and graph. So my least number is negative 1 1/4. My highest is 1/2. And it doesn't matter what order we do this. So let's start with 1/2. Well, 1/2 is positive, so it's to the right of 0. It's halfway in between 0 and 1. Okay, 1/4 is positive, and if we were at 0, and here's 1, and this is a half, and if we divide it into equal parts fourths, then this would be 1/4, so I know it's halfway in between 0 and a half. Negative 1/2, it's the opposite of 1/2, so it's halfway between 0 and negative 1. 1/8, if I went ahead and this was a half, this is 0, and this is 1, this is my 1/4, and so 2 times 2 is 4, and if I go ahead and I split that in half, I get an 8. So that means it's halfway in between 0 and 1/4. Negative 1, and remember that's halfway, 1/4, so negative 1 and 1/4. Negative 3/8, different. So let's look at the specific segment that's between 0 and -1. So we know halfway is -1/2, and halfway between 0 and -1/2 would be -1/4. So this would be -3/4. And so halfway between 0 and +1/4 is going to be 1/8. That's -1/8. And then this 1/4 is the same as 2/8. So if this is 2/8, then halfway between -1/4 and -1/2 has to be 3/8. So that means if -1/4 is here, -3/8 would be right about there. So the last value I have to put in is -3/4. So -3/4. So remember we talked about a fourth is halfway between 0 and 1/2. So 3/4 has to be halfway between 1/2 and 1. And in this case, between -1/2 and -1. So now let's write them in order of least to greatest. So I have my set notation and the least value